There is an ideology that invisibly dominates almost every aspect of our society. It seeps into every nook and cranny it can find, from the cities to the countryside, from our jobs to our homes, from our schools to our political system, and even into our relationships with each other and with the planet. It burrows down into the deepest values we hold, such as freedom, dignity, and choice, and uses them to its own advantage. This ideology has gripped us so tightly that its logic has become intertwined in our own conventional wisdom. You may have never heard its name before, but this ideology is real, it is dangerous, and it is finally being exposed. This ideology is neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? There are many ways to answer that question. You can call it a philosophy, a movement, a political project, or even a set of social values. In its most basic form, however, neoliberalism is an economic ideology that exists within the framework of capitalism. When observed at its philosophical origin, neoliberalism appears as an absolutist mantra that proclaims that a government or state must never intervene in any market or economy, even to provide welfare for its citizenry, lest it put society on a slippery path towards socialism and totalitarianism. The market, which is the wellspring of human freedom, must be allowed to operate free of any constraints or regulations. Anything less is to diminish the freedom of all human beings and place civilization in enormous peril. Practically speaking, neoliberalism refers to the various ways in which our society has elevated competition above all other conceptions of economic rationality, retasked the state with liberating competitive markets, and put increased responsibility onto the private individual to guarantee their own survival. Neoliberalism conceives of the world as one big interconnected competitive market, where human beings derive their freedom from their ability to express their preferences through consumption and represent their value through their ability to sell their labor for wages. Since all people enjoy equal access to and opportunity within this competitive market, inequality between winners and losers is permitted. And because neoliberalism asserts that there is an unbreakable link between economic and political freedom, neoliberalism seeks a world with unfettered economic freedom, which would naturally guarantee political freedom for all. Therefore, according to neoliberalism, the predominant role of government should be to maximize economic freedom, no matter the cost. That might sound to you like a strange way to organize society, and you'd be right. But we live in a world that's been dominated by neoliberalism for close to 4 decades. Beginning in the late 1970s and early 1980s, most of the countries in the world transitioned from the old economic paradigm, one that had been operating mostly successfully since the late 1930s, to a new economic paradigm, specifically a neoliberal economic paradigm. This transition, sometimes referred to as the market turn, was no less than a revolution in economic and political thought, and brought very dramatic changes to society. And yet, one of the most fascinating elements of neoliberalism is how its ideas, its rise, its ensuing power, and even its very existence are still unknown to most people today. Ask anyone you know, even someone who seems particularly attuned to politics or economics, and they will likely struggle to define neoliberalism for you or recall much of its history. In a society that's been neoliberal for as long as ours has, this is extraordinary. As a columnist of The Guardian, George Monbiot has astutely observed, living in the United States, the United Kingdom, or virtually any other country on Earth without knowing what neoliberalism is akin to living in the Soviet Union without ever having heard of communism. You might still be fuzzy about what exactly neoliberalism is, but you have doubtlessly seen many examples of it in your own lifetime. Do you sometimes wonder why grocery stores often throw away food that could easily be given away to the hungry? Do you ever wonder why spikes on the ground are considered a solution to homelessness? Do you often wonder how it is possible to have incredible displays of wealth and opulence alongside abject and desperate poverty in the same community? And do you ever get the strange feeling that the economy, and by extension our roles as consumers, have been clandestinely placed at the center of our moral and political universes? If you do, then a close analysis of neoliberalism and its history will likely shed some insight into those nagging suspicions. In neoliberal societies, the only remedies to social problems considered politically palatable are the ones that rely on the market to deliver the solution, even if that solution doesn't actually solve the problem. The reason why excess food isn't given to the hungry is because the right of a private company to sell groceries at a profit is elevated higher than a vulnerable human being's need to eat. The reason why we place spikes on the ground to disperse homeless people is because we value the rights of property owners and businesses to be free of uncomfortable eyesores more than we care for the plight of property-less people. The solution for these vulnerable people, the argument goes, is to simply pull themselves up and engage in the market to get what they need. For the government to step in and provide affordable housing to the homeless or to give food to the needy, would be unfairly diverting profits from private businesses who only recognize humans as consumers. And the government can't be allowed to help the vulnerable, the argument goes, because to do so would inculcate dependency in the population and lead to greater and greater encroachments of the state. You can probably think of more examples of neoliberal capitalist logic the longer you try. Have you ever wondered why the idea of raising the minimum wage is so controversial? Because wages for workers and laborers are seen as a cost to be minimized, not as an investment in human prosperity or even as a basic requirement of doing business. Why is the idea of taxing the wealthy so controversial? Because neoliberalism asserts that people are wealthy because they simply work harder, work smarter, and are more virtuous. Taxation is seen as stealing from those who have earned and handing out to those who haven't, rather than as leveling a playing field that offers the well-off incredible opportunities to compound their wealth from the beginning of their lives. Why is the government viewed as a perpetual enemy of the market? Because the government's moral contract with its citizens enables it to regulate and restrict the market's ability to trade or speculate recklessly, thereby protecting consumers and limiting the potential profits of businesses. Why is the average American's default mode of transportation a personal vehicle instead of public transportation? Why don't we have universal health care? Or why don't we make internet connectivity a local utility? Why do we allow charter schools and private prisons to exist? Because companies don't want local or federal governments providing cheap, useful services that can be privatized and profited from instead. Why do the wealthiest individuals on the planet own more wealth than billions of other people? Why have the wages of working and middle-class people stagnated for almost 40 years? Why are the costs of basic necessities and opportunities for social mobility rising out of attainability? And why are our political systems now approaching complete disorder and unresponsiveness at the same moment that corporate profits and wealth inequality are at their apex in recent history? These are all natural questions to ask in our neoliberal society, but for many of us they're made taboo or even imperceptible by a normalized culture of economic absurdity that we've been immersed in for so long that we don't see anything out of the ordinary. The only way to break this spell is to re-examine our history and recognize how we arrived at our contemporary moment. The rise of neoliberalism in recent history is at once a vast and overwhelmingly complex phenomenon, but also relatively easy to summarize the more you know about it. The problem is, most people have never even heard of the word neoliberalism, and without careful definition, it's even more difficult to see it in the world around you. And before we get started, no, this has nothing to do with partisan affiliation for one party or another. As we'll see, neoliberalism is a deeper framework for society that both major parties in the United States, liberals and conservatives, subscribe to differing degrees.
To deal with these shortfalls in government services.
In reference to talking about government's role in a free society, you mentioned some of the market failures, and I think that you may have just passed over one that is of utmost importance, and that is of poverty. And in prefacing my question, I'd like to refer to what President Kennedy said, that if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. And to say that, well, we are a government of the people, and when there is a large sector of the people who are hurting, perhaps it is the responsibility of this government of the people to help out. My question is regarding how free are the poor, how free are the unemployed, and how free are those people who are disadvantaged? And so in reference to that, what is government's role?
Sure. First of all, I'm glad to see one vote for the poor. First of all, the government doesn't have any responsibility. People have responsibility. This building doesn't have responsibility. You and I have responsibility. People have responsibility. Second, the question is, how can we as people exercise our responsibility toward our fellow man most effectively? That's the problem. So far as poverty is
excellent schools, support for our veterans, medical research, upgraded infrastructure. Imagine if we could afford all these things. Well, we actually can. But somewhere along the way, we forgot the true power of our currency. We invented the US dollar so we could unleash the full potential of our nation, of our people, of our land, and of our economy, to achieve our greatest aspirations. You see, the United States is a currency issuer. Currency issuers are completely different than currency users. This distinction is a really big deal. Cities, businesses, and households like yours and mine are all currency users. Our federal government is not. Currency issuers are unique. They should not behave like currency users. If you can grasp that, you're already further along than most of our politicians. Currency is our government's money. Only the US government can create our nation's currency. Many countries work this way, but not those like Greece, which gave up their national currency. Not all money is created by the government. Banks, credit card companies, and other institutions also create money each time they issue credit or loan. We call bank money credit to distinguish it from currency. Most of the money in our economy is bank credit, but credit is not the same as currency. Currency plays a unique and important role in our economy. As a nation, we dream big about how to make life better for our citizens and communities. Unlike you and I, who have to earn or borrow money to spend it, we gave our government the exclusive power to issue the national currency. Every time our government spends, it creates currency, usually just by adding numbers to bank accounts on a computer. And when it taxes, it removes some of its currency by subtracting those numbers. It's a bit like keeping score. Adding and subtracting currency to various accounts is like adding and deleting points in a computer game. So our government can't run out of its currency any more than a computer can run out of numbers to add. And it never needs to get points before it can add more. Now you may be wondering, if the government can just issue currency with a computer, why would anyone accept it as payment for anything? Why would it have any value at all? Well, this is where we discover why we have taxes. Federal taxes can only be paid with the government's currency. In order to pay our taxes and stay in Uncle Sam's good graces, we have to first get its currency. By requiring that we return that currency to pay our taxes, the government creates continual demand for the currency it alone issues. Now, because some people, including many of our politicians, don't understand the difference between currency issuers and currency users, they think Uncle Sam needs our tax money to pay for spending. But it's actually the other way around. The government spending gives us the currency we need to pay our taxes. So those taxes simply remove from the economy some of the currency which was already issued by the federal government. This helps our economy stay in a healthy balance. One of the biggest responsibilities of the currency issuer is to make sure it isn't causing unemployment or inflation by taxing or spending too much or too little. The really powerful part about all this is that not only can currency issuers like the US never go broke, but they can also always afford whatever they're authorized to do. But if the government doesn't need money from external sources to fund that spending, what's with all this fear about the national debt? Don't we owe China $1 kajillion or something? Aren't we worried they'll stop buying our government bonds? Well, not really. Think about it. How can we borrow US dollars from China when all US dollars are made in the USA? You see, China gets their US currency through trade. They send us stuff, and we pay them with currency, which they, along with many other countries, like to save. We like to save currency too. US government bonds are actually just big savings accounts, a really safe way to hold currency that's already been spent into existence. So that big, scary-sounding number that's commonly called the national debt is actually just a record of all the savings of US dollars since our country began. All the currency that's been spent into the economy and not yet taxed back. That's nothing to fear. You probably noticed that our government is almost always adding more currency into our economy than it takes out in taxes. We call this a government deficit, but it's actually a completely normal and necessary response to people saving its currency. You see, our capitalist economy is dependent on sales growth. Money that's being stashed away or spent overseas isn't being spent on the goods we produce here at home. When US sales fall, our employers have less income, and they're eventually forced to cut production and jobs. As the sole issuer of our currency, the government plays a vital role in helping our economy keep growing. We decide what we want our government paying for, and that sets the amount of currency it creates via spending. The government should then adjust the amount it removes via taxation to just enough so our economy stays at full employment and avoids inflation. In other words, Congress is supposed to manage the currency to balance the economy. Freeing our government from senseless limitations like debt ceilings and balancing the budget, enables it to use its sovereign currency powers to accomplish the real and serious tasks for which it was formed in the first place. Tasks like putting available resources to work on our infrastructure, investing in the health and education of our people, ensuring our safety and well-being, ending unemployment and keeping our economy growing, taking care of our retired, our sick, our hungry, our poor, our huddled masses. Sound familiar? As we rediscover the power of our sovereign currency, let's hold our government accountable to use it wisely, for our nation's prosperity and for the well-being of all its citizens.
The Chinese stole this idea from America. Don't worry, there was no patent or copyright, so there's no IP violations going on here, but they stole the idea from an American, maybe the greatest political philosopher in America, a man named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall political party, used to say, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. So this conception, this kind of conception of politics has an obvious logic to it, right? Because if you control the nomination, every candidate is going to worry what you, the nominator, think. So you practically control the candidate, whether or not you control the ultimate election. We can call that genius theory for destroying democracy, Tweedism. Tweedism. Any two-stage process where the Tweeds get to nominate and then the rest get to select is Tweedism, and the consequence of Tweedism obviously is to produce a system responsive to Tweeds only. Now, Tweedism was practiced not just in the North, not just in New York, it was practiced in the South too. Texas, 1923, practiced Tweedism. By law, in 1923, Texas passed a statute that said in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote. Only whites could vote. Blacks could vote in the general election if, of course, they could get registered, given all the barriers to registration, but only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. And of course, back then, hard to imagine, but back then, the only party that mattered was the Democratic Party in Texas. So in this two-stage process, blacks were excluded from the first stage, 16% of Texas excluded from this critical first stage, with the consequence obviously producing a democracy responsive to whites only. Now, those cases are obvious to us. Everyone looks at that and says, there's something obviously wrong with those so-called democracies to set up their structure in that way. So why don't we see it here? We take it for granted in the United States that campaigns will be privately funded. But we need to recognize funding is its own contest. Funding is its own primary. We have the voting system where people vote, but in the first stage to that, there is a money primary that determines which candidates are allowed to run in those voting elections. Now, that money primary takes time. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. This is an old telephone, you might not recognize this, but dialing for dollars, calling people all across the country to get the money they need to run their campaigns or to get their party back into power. B.F. Skinner gave us this wonderful image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push for its sustenance. This is a picture of the life of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson comes to learn which buttons he or she needs to push to get the sustenance he or she needs to make his or her campaign successful. This is their life, and it has an effect. Each of them, as they do this, develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And to clarify, she went on, you know, he was not an environmentalist. So this obviously is a primary too. It's the money primary. It's not a white primary, it's the green primary. It's the first stage in a multi-stage process to select the candidates who will represent us. So if this is the structure, we should interrogate who are the funders. Well, we can think about who the biggest funders are. In 2014, the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million funders to congressional campaigns. In this election cycle so far, 400 families have given half the money in the election contributions and contributions to super PACs so far. 400 families. That's not American democracy, that is banana republic democracy. And then we can think not just about the biggest funders, but think about the relevant funders. Of course, the people giving millions of dollars have the attention of the members of Congress. But how much do you need to give to be relevant? How much do you need to give to matter to those Congress people as they're dialing for dollars to raise money from you? Well, let's take the people who maxed out in 2014. And in 2014, that means you gave $5,200 to at least one candidate in the general primary and in the general election. 2014, it turns out 57,874 Americans maxed out in that way. So we could say 57,874 gave enough to matter, to control, to be the dominant force in this first stage of the election process. And then some of you out there, the math geniuses out there, beginning to do the numbers, you're thinking 57,874? Wait a minute. That's 0.02% of America. 0.02% of America dominate this first stage in the process of electing the candidates who will represent us. They pick the candidates, because you can't be credible unless you get their money, and we get to vote for those candidates. This tiny fraction of the 1%, this Chinese fraction of the 1%, dominate this first stage with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to these funders only. This Princeton study, which is a Harvard professor I'm not allowed to talk about much, so let's get it off the stage quick, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of actual decisions by our government in the history of political science, related the actual decisions of our government over the past 40 years with the views of the economic elite, the views of organized interest groups, and the views of the average voter. And what they found was there was a nice correlation between the views of the economic elite and what our government actually did. So as you go from 0% of the elite supporting something to 100%, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Same thing with organized special interest groups. As the number of them supports something increases, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Here's the graph for the average voter. It's a flat line. Flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is, as the percentage of average voters supporting a proposal goes from 0 to 100%, it doesn't change the probability that that proposal will be enacted. As they put in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. This is true. All right, so here's the picture that we had. We were told of our democracy. There we were, citizens driving the bus. But here's the reality. The reality is, the steering wheel has become detached from this bus. We don't drive the bus anymore. We do not anecdotally, in the most aggressive empirical analysis, have no relationship to what our government does. This is a product of tweedism. Tweedism. And what tweedism is first corruption. It's a corruption of the design of our representative democracy. When Madison gave us our representative democracy, he described it in Federalist 52 to be a system that would have a branch, Congress, that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone, an exclusive dependence. But that's not our Congress. They're dependent on the people and dependent on the Tweeds. And then to go on, to clarify, Madison in Federalist 57 said, by the people, he means, quote, not the rich more than the poor. not the rich more than the poor. But that's not our reality. The people today mean not the rich more than the poor, except for the Tweeds. The Tweeds have more power than the middle class and the poor. This is corruption. It's not criminals. It's a system in which decent people who come to this city to do the right thing find themselves bent to do the thing the Tweeds demand, because that's the only way you can survive. It is corruption, but it is caused by a basic inequality that we've allowed to evolve inside of our representative system. An inequality. Remember Orwell's all animals are created equal, and what we've got here, all animals are created equal, but the Tweeds are more equal than others. It is inequality. But what's critical about recognizing that it's inequality is if we could remove the inequality, if we could address that fundamental inequality in this representative democracy, if we could neutralize this Tweedism, then we could crack the corruption that makes it impossible for our government to do any of the things we want our government to do. We could achieve a system dependent on the people alone, because only the people would be having the influence inside that government. It would be a system where not the rich more than the poor were the people, because everyone would, because of this equality, have the capacity to press the government in the direction they want the government pressed. Equality. I'm not talking about wealth equality. That's important to worry about too. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the equality we have as citizens. Now, to get that, what I've been arguing we need to talk about is a statute that Congress ought to pass tomorrow. Statute, let's call it the Citizen Equality Act.
Started trying to row back at it, by which time it was too late. In the UK and in the US, the warfare state became a welfare state. And we enjoyed, as a result, the most democratic, progressive, redistributive era we have ever had. And what we're seeing now is the fading of that force and the return, big time, of oligarchic power. It's been pouring billions of dollars into a new politics whose aim effectively is to crush the gains that we've achieved since the Second World War and to crush democracy. So it's desperately important that we revive a powerful, progressive, democratic politics based on egalitarian principles, and at the same time produce far more effective strategies for overthrowing oligarchic power by peaceful means, through organizing on a massive scale, through using a new science of social tipping to show how you can just transform the way that society behaves if you can generate enough momentum behind new ideas. But it can't be done passively. It can't be done accidentally. It can't be done half-heartedly. It has to be a massive program of mobilization. We have to get millions and millions of people behind the new ideas, behind a progressive settlement, to take on the oligarchs and overthrow their undemocratic power. Because otherwise, we end up with systems of extreme oppression and repression, which have characterized the great majority of history in centralized states. I don't want to wait until there's another total war. I don't want to see a massive violent revolution in which millions of people die. I don't want to see state collapse. I don't want to see a vast plague wiping out a third of the population. These are the forces that in the past have destroyed oligarchic power. We have to be clever enough to find the means of doing it without them.